I say, my loves, this is your girl, Empress Goddess, the Georgia Peach. Coming back to you again. Let's go ahead and discover the presence of God.
Of its prime elements and by identification of non-essentials. Many of these have already been identified in previous books in these published studies, such as Truth versus Falsehood, Hawkins, 2005. Thus, aberrant spiritual teachings can be avoided. Also of benefit are the highly calibrated teachings and practices that are verifiably integrous. Devotion. Spiritual commitment is energized by the alignment of the spiritual will, calibration level 850, with the attributes of divinity, which are truth, love, compassion, wisdom, and non-partiality. Devotion prioritizes one's life and attracts that which is of assistance. To be a servant of God is a dedication whereby the goal takes precedence over all other positionalities, attractions, or distractions. By devotion and commitment, the pathway unfolds, and revelation supplants presumptive cause and effect acquisition. It could be languaged that the dedication is quite powerfully yang by intent, but yin by fulfillment as a process. All actions become recontextualized, and their spiritual essence begins to shine through appearances. Devotion also expresses as selfless service, whereby peeling the potatoes is no longer a chore, but an act of love because it has been sanctified by intention. Eventually, all action is dedicated as an act of worship. Devotion opens up vision, which replaces perception. Only by the surrender that accompanies devotion does intended action reveal itself to be a spontaneous unfolding of the evolution of creation itself. Devotion to God replaces the ego's devotion to its own self-interest, and one witnesses the effects or consequences of the overall field. Worship is recontextualized by devotion. It is not done for the benefit of the worshiper or the imaginary benefit to God, but instead it is merely an acknowledgement of reality. It is aligned with gratitude for the gift of awareness, consciousness, as the reality of the knower, self. It is by virtue of the truth of the reality of divinity that the reality of divinity can be realized, apperceived, and comprehended, which results in gratitude for the capacity for the recognition. Thus, devotion is not the same as piety, nor is it a mood, but instead it is a way of life and a way of being with oneself, God, and the world. In duality, manifestation is perceived as linear, and therefore there are both a cause and an effect to be conceptualized and perceived. Positionalities result in perception, and vice versa. Thus, the intrinsic spiritual truths of religion, context, became obscured historically by people, places, objects, dates, and ethnic legend, content. Also, by conceptual limitation, divinity became anthropomorphized and conceived of as having the limitations of human emotional proclivities, such as favoritism, anger, jealousy, pride, and egoistic needs. By analogy, it is apparent that sunlight and the sky merely are, without partiality or arbitrary preference. Despite limitations, within the core of religions is the primordial spiritual truth from which they arose. Note, however, that religions progressively calibrate lower than the calibrated levels of the truth of their great spiritual teachers, the founders, avatars. Thus, much becomes lost via ecclesiastical doctrines' contamination and dilution by cultural, ethnic, and political splinter subgroups and their belief systems. Non-duality means to bypass particularization and return to unobstructed, verifiable, basic truth. Throughout history, all the great sages have proclaimed the same truths. Although many great sages began their personal lives with traditional religion, they eventually transcended the institutional limitations. Self-realization resulted in their descriptive categorization or nominalization as mystics, about which there is much misinformation, due to the lack of accurate understanding of the condition, which is an intrinsic inner state. Transcendence by illumination is statistically unusual and therefore frequently baffles comprehension. Over time, however, mysticism became clarified as the inner pathway to the realization of the religious spiritual truths of God as immanent, rather than, as commonly described religiously, only transcendent. Advanced levels of spiritual evolution, however, were traditionally recognized and often designated as sainthood. Non-duality means without form, division, or limitation, such as time, locality, or mentalization, including arbitrary linear presumptions. Divinity is, by its innate qualities, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, and all evolves as a consequence of the unmanifests becoming manifest as evolutionary creation. Divinity emanates as consciousness awareness, which sources creation in its expression as the emergence of existence. The conditions implied by the terms beingness, existence, awareness, or consciousness are without subject or object and devoid of causal qualities. The nonlinear is therefore a field of infinite power by which manifestation emerges as the consequence of potentiality, which itself is an expression of creation. Within that which is perceived is the unseen as the source of all that exists. Devotion to non-duality. If in reality there is no separate this, me, or elsewhere that, God, how do the illusions of the unreal become replaced by the real? The way is not by acquiring even more information or knowledge about God, but instead by surrendering all suppositions. The core of devotion is humility and the willingness to surrender all belief systems and illusions of I know. The realization of the presence of divinity unfolds of its own when the ego and its perceptual positionalities are surrendered. To know, it is necessary to drop the limiting impairment of the illusion of knowing about. The mind collects knowledge, facts, and mentations that are limited by context and paradigm of mentalization. The realization emerges from a paradigm different from that of the linear conceptual mind. Thus, mind is replaced by mind. While mind is talkative, mind is silent and unmoving. Yet do all seeming things move within it. In contrast, evolution appears to ordinary mind as the consequence of cause and effect, because of the perceptions of form, time, and change. Thus, spiritual evolution means to move from identification with content, linear mind, to context, nonlinear mind. Spiritual evolution in itself brings forth the transformation in the non-form of realization, which is beyond conceptualization or languaging, and instead becomes apparent and dominant without the necessity of thought. Traditionally, the way of non-duality has been the province of the mystics of all religions who sought the realization of truth rather than just worshiping its description. The Buddha thus became perhaps the most well-known and prominent example of the inner journey, whereby the illusory world of the ego's Maya is transcended and dissolved by the surrendering of attachments to the sensory linear perceptions that camouflage the unity and oneness of creation. It is the invisible presence of the non-linear within the linear that gives it reality. In the Hindu tradition, the Sanskrit term for non-duality is Advaita, as exemplified by Vedanta. And in the Islamic religion, the non-linear mode is exemplified by the Sufis. In Christianity, Jesus taught that heaven is within you, and the great Christian mystics, Unio Mystica, were given recognition as saints. Their inner spiritual struggles have been recorded in their autobiographical accounts and have been inspirational and revered over the centuries. Common to all the above is the core of intense devotion that signifies total commitment to divinity as both the means and the end. An unnecessary deterrent to devotees of the inner path in traditional Christianity was the ecclesiastical condemnation of the ego's proclivities as sin, rather than as merely developmental delays or obstacles of consciousness itself. As becomes apparent, the ego's original evolutionary purpose was merely to ensure survival in the animal world, which therefore required linear identification of friend from foe, edible from inedible, and so on. Instinctual drives were religiously labeled as evil, and therefore, because of the nature of the human psyche, they were denied, suppressed, projected onto others, or at least compensated for by guilt, self-condemnation, penance, suffering, or even the payment of money as indulgences, or a variety of other, including animal, sacrifices. These guilty self-condemnations were also a consequence and in accord with primitive views of God as being angry and destructive and therefore having to be appeased. The depictions of really a satanic version of God reached their most grotesque demonstration in the Aztec and Mayan religions, which required the constant sacrifice of endless thousands of humans, especially the innocent young, whose hearts were cut out while they were still beating. Such extremes are still actively pursued by fundamentalist factions of religious extremists, such as today's pursuers of theocratic totalitarianism, for example, ritualistic beheading. Because of the proclivity of the human ego mind to embrace very severe error, the Buddha recommended avoiding the use of the term God altogether. In devotional non-duality, the likelihood of error is bypassed by devotion to the essential non-linear qualities of divinity itself, such as compassion, oneness, love, truth, omniscience, eternal, infinite, omnipresence, and omnipotence, beyond form, place, time, human instincts, or emotions. Divine justice rules as a consequence of its intrinsic, innate qualities of infinite power, and is not limited by positionalities or volitional qualities. Thus, divinity is not to be feared, but instead highly respected and revered. When the evil depictions of the ego are transcended, it is then no longer necessary to try to escape it, overcome it, attack it, or project it either onto others or onto God. While the primary prerequisite for adherence to religion is faith, the essential required qualities needed for following the pathway of non-duality are humility, surrender, and devotional dedication to the pathway. It is readily observable that followers of religions are characterized by the presumption of I know, via scriptural authority, ecclesiastical doctrine, historical precedent, etc. In contrast, the spiritual devotee of non-duality starts from the basic, more truthful position, I, of myself, don't know. In Christianity, Jesus Christ is the way, and without his help, grace, the ego, sin, cannot be transcended. Although heaven is within you, its reality is not realizable without a savior because of the sheer tenacity of the ego. Thus, Jesus taught the way to salvation. In contrast, the Buddha taught the pathway to enlightenment, which, however, was not possible to realize without the grace of the enlightened teacher. The traditional spiritual devotee usually combines the approaches of both faith and self-inquiry. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism emphasize divinity as transcendent. The mystics of the world's great traditions focus instead on the realization of divinity as immanent. Whether God is conceived of as transcendental, immanent, or both is a province of res interna, and the realization that God is both immanent and transcendent, res externa, extensa, is a consequence of the realization of the self and enlightenment. Discussion. Question. What is different about the pathway of devotional non-duality compared to traditional teachings? Answer. It is characterized by the elimination of all trappings and non-essentials, for time is short and narrow are the gates. It is therefore not pertinent to the past, doctrine, dogma, historical rituals, personages, events, or belief systems. Empowerment is from within, by assent of the will. Truth stands forth of its own when the obstacles are removed. The call is from within rather than a response to exhortation from without. The source is both the initiator as well as the destination. Spiritual information is now available for the first time, that throughout history has never before been accessible. The capacity to identify truth from falsehood and the degree of its expression is now a major asset and advantage. According to consciousness research, the likelihood of reaching enlightenment is now approximately 1,000 times more likely than it was in the past. Question. But is not the quest for enlightenment difficult or even obscure? Answer. It is no longer as difficult. There is much greater clarity about the structure, origin, and evolutionary mechanisms of the ego. Its function no longer needs to be obscured by moralistic religious denunciation. Pejorative religious terminology of the ego mind's evolutionary propensities created intimidation and fearful guilty resistance, and therefore great reluctance to really look inside oneself. If viewed with clarity, the ego's mechanisms obviously seem to be merely the means for presumptive biological, emotional survival. They served the evolution and survival of the animal body and its primitive mental mechanisms. The ego is now conceived to be primitive rather than evil or demonic. In human ego psychology, that which is given severely pejorative labels tends to become repressed, or at least suppressed, as well as denied, rejected, and projected onto the world, other people, and even onto divinity. Such depictions also result in other psychological measures, such as opposite formation, excessive attempts at undoing, obsessive guilt, self-condemnation, self-hatred, and seeing oneself as evil, hateful, and unlovable. With a more enlightened view, the ego is merely seen to be needful of correction and transcendence. Question. Is not the pathway of non-duality arduous? Answer. It is not the pathway that is arduous, but merely the degree of the ego's resistance to it. This resistance is overcome by invoking the will, which then institutes the spiritual capacities for dedication, effort, and the willingness to surrender obstacles. Devotion invites the power of love, by which humility removes the ego's props and positionalities. It also activates the utilization of information that is transformative. Intention energizes willingness, which thereby enables transformation to replace the limitations consequent to resistance. It is only necessary to institute rather simple procedures and processes that could be likened to spiritual engineering, by which identifying the structures and forces involved automatically reveals the necessary processes required to undo the basic structural functions. Question. Example? Answer. A person feels trapped by what is believed to be a worldly goal, such as money, fame, or possessions. With analysis, it becomes clear that it is not the things themselves to which one is attracted or attached, but primarily the juice or pleasurable emotional gratification attached to them. It is really not winning that is desired or important, but the payoff of the juice of emotional satisfaction itself. Thus, the question arises not whether one can relinquish the desire for wealth and fame, but could one surrender the juice of the payoff to God? With resistance, the mind may think, no, I can't. But then, if questioned again, at gunpoint, could you? The answer is obviously, oh yes. Therefore, the underlying process of resistance is not could, but would. Can't implies impossibility, whereas don't want to or would implies that the real underlying resistance is that of unwillingness. To surrender a goal does not mean to automatically lose it. What is elusive via greed often effortlessly materializes as a consequence of evolving to a higher level of consciousness. Note that the level of experiential happiness rises in exact accord with the level of consciousness and not with material success. Question: why is devotion necessary or important? Answer: the mind is often aware of error and character defects, but it lacks the power or incentive to surrender them. Devotion is of the heart and has the strength and motivation to overcome resistances and obstacles beyond the capacity of mere mentalization. An aspect of devotional love is constancy, as well as loyalty and commitment, no matter what. Devotion includes fortitude and alignment with endeavor, and is like the glue that holds all these aspects together. Devotion is like an inner valor or fortitude that incorporates courage, willingness, and conviction together with the knowledge of essential information. It develops wisdom, patience, and forbearance with experience. Because of focus, it also develops skill and aptitude for processing the levels of consciousness as they are encountered, as per Transcending the Levels of Consciousness, Hawkins, 2006. Devotion learns to expect periods of delay or discouragement as well as moments of doubt or fear. By virtue of devotion, there is alignment with inner integrity that results in the self-honesty and conviction necessary to transcend the seduction of transitory emotional payoffs of the intransigent ego. The desire to reach enlightenment is already a divine gift to be treasured and revered. Many are called, but few are chosen, could be rephrased as many are called, but few choose to follow. Thus, the choice is by decision and assent of the inner will, and by this assent, the enormous power of divine will aligns with intention and empowers devotion to overcome all obstacles. Chapter 2: The Inner Path. Introduction. All people live by faith. The only variable is in what that faith is placed. The selection reflects a level of consciousness that in turn is correlated with perception, values, and intrinsic capacity for comprehension and primary motivation. Predominant in human history is alliance with the animal instincts of physical survival, and therefore the accumulation of the means to that end. Akin to bodily survival is the seeking of pleasure, which energizes curiosity and eventually thought. Survival is enhanced by group formation as family, tribe, and society, the success of which depends on the development of communication and the organization of relationship. Discourse arises from the capacity for ideation and language that progress from the concrete, literal, and physical to symbolic abstraction as the capacity for intellection. Eventually, out of curiosity arise the basic existential questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where do we go? These are basically the questions of identity as well as of the purpose and meaning of life itself. Thus began the basic surge for a primordial truth by which to contextualize life and extract meaning, significance, and value. Some people are satisfied with merely the rudimentary mechanics of physical animal pleasure and survival, but over the ages, the majority of mankind has intuited a greater understanding and meaning that have come about via great teachers and spiritual geniuses. Great prophets, sages, and avatars emerged, and their spiritual energy and levels of consciousness were so high that they profoundly influenced and shaped civilization for millennia. The world's great religions emerged as a major dominant influence over civilizations by providing a greater contextualization of reality and its derivative expressions as meaning, values, and philosophical formulation that were the basic structure of society and even of government itself. Religions beneficially provided an ethical and moral context for law, social behavior, and organization. Interestingly, some societies, after incorporating the basic structures that arose from religion, such as government and law, eventually formally eliminated the recognition of religions from which they had emerged. Thus, officially secular nations, by virtue of their origination, operate according to religious principles: human rights, equality, morality, ethics, accountability, responsibility, etc. The core of spiritual truth innate to religion survived as the basic principles of civilization itself. Discussion. Throughout the history of civilization, mankind has sought to understand the significance of human life, and different cultures have produced a variety of religious as well as philosophical and mythical belief systems. Religions often became dominant theocracies, by which values were reinforced through laws and social customs. Common to all religions, however, was the concept of divinity, or spiritual reality, exemplified by monotheism, or a pantheon of gods or dominant spirits whose primary characteristic was power. Thus, divinity was universally worshipped in various forms by acknowledging sovereignty. The calibrated level of truth of the various religions over time shows a very wide range, and in some very primitive societies, it calibrated far below level 200, with the religious emphasis on animal, but especially human sacrifice, as well as overt cruelty by which the populace was terrorized. For example, the Mayan religion calibrated at 95. In comparison, other religions were based on the inspiration of prophets, who calibrated well above 200, and yet the religions continued to include ritual sacrifice and subordination of the people. From Abraham arose the three great religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Followers of these great religions became related as people of the book, the sons of Abraham, who unfortunately subsequently engaged in rivalry and bloodshed. Approximately 5,000 years prior to the emergence of the Semitic religions, the great Aryan sages emerged in ancient India. The influence of these sages is indicated by their extremely high calibrations of levels of truth as exhibited by the Vedas and the Upanishads teachings ascribed to Krishna, calibrates as 1,000. These revelations of spiritual truth are depicted as non-linear and therefore non-dualistic, as were exemplified by the teachings of the Buddha, calibrates at 1,000, who appeared in approximately 563 BC. The teachings of Jesus Christ, calibrates at 1,000, clarified the relationship between God and man, and monotheism was later substantiated and glorified by the teachings of Muhammad, original calibration level 700. Thus, spiritual truth of very high calibrated validity became widely available and spread throughout all human civilization. Even Aboriginal societies and civilizations, such as Native American, spontaneously discovered the reality of the divinity of God and accorded reverence to the Great Spirit as creator. The contrast between non-duality and traditional religion. The traditional religions involve the requirement for learning or even memorizing ecclesiastical religious doctrines and their historical or mythological origins and sources, including even times and places, along with the citation of authority, precedent, and illustrious figures and contributors. Also included are religious rules and regulations, as well as prescriptions regarding lifestyle, dress, hairstyles, etc. In addition, requirements evolved, such as attendance, membership, and group commitments. These usually resulted in social group inclusions and exclusions that involved group identifications and classifications. For example, believers versus non-believers. In addition, there emerged rules of conduct and relationship, including marriage, procreation, and social and sexual activities based on ecclesiastical doctrine, correlated with specific ethnic tribal cultures limited in time and geography. By virtue of their origination, cultural lifestyles became intertwined with religious teachings that included various interpretations of the actual teachings of the original great teacher, founder, avatar. Often, centuries elapsed before the teachings, which had been verbally handed down over time, became translated into written language. The exact, final wording was often somewhat contentious, and various factions sought dominance or control. Thus, some scriptures were actually arrived at by virtue of the voting of various groups. Formal scriptures finally emerged, but at a lower calibration level than that of the original teachings. Error was also consequent to misquotes, as well as editing by sequential scribes. Contributing to the decline was the inclusion of extraneous matters that were given importance equal to the essentials. A primary value of traditional religions, however, is that the mystical illuminations of the great founders became languaged and presented in a contextualization that was comprehensible to larger numbers of people who were neither spiritually nor intellectually sophisticated. Therefore, myth and fable often became included for their pedagogical value and appeal. This was of pragmatic value in that it translated the seemingly abstract to the more easily comprehensible, concrete, literal exemplifications. A brilliant distillation of the essential spiritual truths and the world's great religions is exemplified by the following. 1. Christianity is the path of love and forgiveness. 2. Buddhism is the path of compassion. 3. Judaism is the path of living by sacred law. 4. Baha'i is the path of unity and peace. 5. Islam is the path of submission to the will of God. 6. Confucianism is the path of deliberate tradition. 7. Taoism is the path of ultimate reality. 8. Native American practice is the path of primal spirituality. 9. Shintoism is the path of tribal ancestry. 10. Hinduism is the path of knowledge, action, and devotion. 11. Science of mind is the path of the divine principle of love and law. 12. The global heart vision is of a world that works for everyone. Henderson, R., 2005. Non-dualistic teachings. Concepts and teachings that calibrate below 600 are comprehensible to the majority of people, and the teachings in the calibration range of the 500s, love, have a major influence. Although the perfection of love to the level of unconditional love at calibration 540 is reached by only 0.4% of today's overall world population, it is nonetheless comprehended as a real experiential possibility, and exceptional individuals who continue to evolve in consciousness to the high 500s are termed saints, thereby serving as models for humanity as a practical goal. The spiritual ecstasy of the very high 500s is also recorded. For example, Ramakrishna or the great Christian saints, and thereby given credence and acceptance as a possible reality for those who are exceptionally motivated or gifted. At consciousness level 500, there is a major shift of paradigm, and from consciousness level 600 and up, the spiritual reality is described as ineffable or mystical. Its non-dual quality, that is, no mind or mind, makes such a condition difficult to language or conceptualize, and therefore seemingly limited as an actual experiential possibility. Advanced students are familiar with the writings of the great sages, whose work is characterized by the Sanskrit terms Advaita and Vedanta, about which there is considerable information available through the writings of recent well-known teachers, such as Ramana Maharshi or Nisargadatta Maharaj. On a similar level are the teachings of great well-known mystics of all religions, such as the Sufis, the Kabbalah, or the Zohar. Of major importance and also well-known are the teachings of the Buddha, the Hindu sages, and the Zen adepts. Credence as to the actuality and reality of enlightenment is supported by the rather extensive literature about such states by well-known scholars, such as William James, and later scholars of the Zen tradition, such as D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts. The difficulty in describing or explaining such states is simply that the consciousness level of the intellect is limited to the 400s and includes the presumption of cause and effect. Despite the descriptions, the states themselves are nonlinear and thus can be alluded to but not accurately described in familiar language. Despite the limitation of accurate depiction, the reality of such states is universally recognized, and most recently, such states have been validated by calibrated levels of consciousness research, which confirms the reality of enlightened states of consciousness. Despite their statistical rarity, such advanced states are inspirational and give recognition to the potential of human consciousness to evolve. The fact that the enlightened condition is not comprehensible, explicable, or possible of acquisition by the mind-intellect dismays spiritual seekers. Thus, such states may seem unreachable and therefore not practical as a goal. On the contrary, in actuality, advanced states are powerfully experiential because the reality that they confirm and reflect is already a fact consequent to the very obvious actuality that one already exists. Thus, every spiritual student already has met the primordial requisite quality, and it is only necessary to add motivation and commitment. Thus, the only requirements are first to exist, then to have heard of enlightenment, and then to seek it as a realizable goal. What makes it seem difficult is the dearth of simple information and clarification, for experientially the way is innately simple, although at times seemingly arduous. Another reason that reaching the state of enlightenment seems impractical is because the mind conceptualizes in terms of cause and effect, and students conceive of themselves as being driven, that is, implying inner willpower, etc., instead of the reality that they are actually being attracted by their future destiny. Comfort and confidence can be derived from a verifiable reality that the rare persons who are actually attracted to enlightenment as a life goal are attracted because that is already their destiny, calibrates as true. For the same reason, only future golfers would be taking golf lessons. Question: how does the inner pathway differ from traditional religious observance? Answer. The emphasis is on the inner experiential subjective realization and internal validation of spiritual truth. In contrast, religion is formalized and historically structured in an authoritative context that stresses conformation to observances, rituals, customs, and belief systems. Thereby, the origination of truth is projected backwards in time to other cultures, places, and ethnic circumstances. In addition, there is also emphasis on mystification, glorification, and dramatization, intermingled with theological doctrine. In religion, divinity is contextualized primarily as elsewhere in time and location, and is also described as having human motivations, limitations, and defects. Religion emphasizes belief rather than the inner realization of truth. In religion, there is also a major emphasis on spiritual destiny in the future after physical death, rather than on the experiencing of spiritual truth in the present. Question. What personality characteristics are favorable for the inner pathway? Answer. Characteristically, devotees tend to be introspective, thoughtful, reflective, curious, responsible, and attentive. There is usually an aversion to violence, cruelty, non-integrity, and the fanfare and drama of glamour or vulgarity. There are the attraction to learning for its own sake and the pleasure of discovery of basic premises. Question. What of the demands of daily life? Answer. The inner path is a way of continuously being with oneself and life in the world, whereas religious observance tends to become compartmentalized. Spiritual devotion is a continuous inner lifestyle that incorporates constant, watchful awareness. External occurrences are transitory, whereas inner qualities of consciousness are more permanent. Inner work is a constant learning process whereby there are pleasure and satisfaction in discovery and the unfolding of insight. The process is self-rewarding, and paradoxically, this results in greater benefit and enjoyment of formal religious participation or practices as well. The reflections of truth are everywhere to be seen and recognized in multitudinous expressions. By internal observation, there develops an inner wisdom that facilitates compassion and spiritual comprehension rather than an ought-to discipline. With inner awareness, religious guilt and preoccupation with sin diminish, and instead, one chooses positive options rather than being controlled by negative programs resulting in shame, fear, and guilt. Fulfillment of potential is rewarding and gratifying, which in turn progressively reinforces motivation. Self-honesty brings greater inner freedom as well as adaptational expertise and flexibility. It is not necessary to withdraw from the world, but instead to recontextualize it. Spiritual evolution results in greater capability due to the advancement of consciousness that ensues. It is a matter of motivation. It is not necessary to go into monastic retreat, although there may be such periods that are beneficial. Question. What is a workable goal? Answer. To verify spiritual truth experientially and to become it rather than just conform to it. The process is an unfolding of discovery, resulting in greater happiness and diminution of fear, guilt, and other negative emotions. The motive is inner development, evolution, and fulfillment of potential, which is independent of the external world. Life becomes progressive rather than just repetitive. All experience is of equal value and innately pleasurable, so that life stops being an endless sequence of alternating pleasure and displeasure. With inner progress, context expands, resulting in greater awareness of significance and meaning, and therefore gratification of potential. Question. Inner spiritual work seems to require discipline and endeavor. Answer. These requirements are activated by intention. There is an innate gratification in spiritual growth and the evolution of consciousness itself. Progress is the consequence of clarification and greater understanding that arise from the expansion of context. Recontextualization, then, results in transcending the distortions of perception. Question. Inner work concerns focus rather than specific special activity. Answer. The average person is focused on participating successfully in the world and its activities via education, success, relationships, etc. The inner work, to know thyself, is focused on inner comprehension of life events, including expectations, motives, attitudes, and habitual thought patterns. Curiosity arises. Why do I see that situation the way I do? Or why do I feel as I do? What is my prevailing attitude? And what programs are actually running my mind? These questions lead to an interesting discovery of prevailing presumptions about oneself, life, and others. Prevailing goals and values become apparent for examination, as well as the degree to which they are prioritized. Question. That brings up the quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Answer. Although the quotation might seem to be somewhat of an overstatement, it does contain a valuable truth observation, which is so validated by the premises of quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg principle, in that observation itself changes outcome as a consequence of not only the introduction of the field of consciousness, but also its intention. To a highly aware person, most people seem to walk about as if they are in some kind of a dream state, unconscious and unaware of themselves. Self-observation leads to awakening, which then motivates the desire to learn, grow, mature, and evolve. Self-inquiry leads to discovery and the unfolding of the layers that obscure the self. With self-inquiry, one examines the basis for faith and beliefs, and by instituting spiritual techniques and criteria, proceeds to discover the inner validation of spiritual truths for oneself. Thus, the field of inquiry is the function of consciousness awareness and the manner in which it contextualizes the inner experience of self, others, and divinity. There is a difference between having heard a truth and having discovered it as an inner reality. The way to be it is to own it as an experiential reality. Question. But is that not what is called solipsism? Answer. Solipsism is an intellectual belief that only the subjective experience of the self is real. Thus, people live in different subjective realities. Solipsism is valid up to a point as it applies to the ego self. That is, each person lives within their own perceptual version of reality. In contrast, this limitation is transcended by the very process of inner spiritual work, which progresses to the elimination of the limitations of perception, that is, the world of illusion, so as to reveal the reality of the self. Chapter 3. Orientation. Introduction. Spiritual evolution is supported by education and information up to the point where the intellect is no longer a primary tool as it is in ordinary learning. The spiritual work then transitions from the mental, intellectual, conceptual, linear to the nonlinear region of human consciousness, which relates more to context than to content and form or data. The transition is from the specific content to the quality of subjective experiencing itself. This major shift entails reliance on different qualities, such as faith, intention, devotion, volition, and the will. Character traits are called into action, and attitudes are of greater practical use than specific ideas. Whereas ordinary information is acquired by effort, in spiritual endeavor, the emphasis is on relinquishing, letting go, and surrendering. The work involves identifying positionalities and then transcending the ego's resistances and relinquishing its illusory control or sovereignty. Thus, the core of spiritual work is aligned with undoing and the unloading of the mind rather than its enrichment. To seek enlightenment is a major decision. The decision itself is therefore akin to a yang position, but subsequently, the process itself is more intrinsically akin to a yin posture. While the ordinary ego is programmed to getting, spiritual intention now shifts to allowing, similar to floating in the water rather than flailing about or swimming in it. The actual process is innately simple, yet challenging of accomplishment by virtue of the innate structure of the ego mind, which resists loss of dominion by inventing a plethora of arguments and defenses. Another resistance is that ordinary mind dislikes taking responsibility, even for very trivial matters. For example, who forgot to lock the screen door? Not me. It must have been the dog. Posture. The spiritual practice of seeking enlightenment via non-duality is the consequence of intention and commitment. Its actual practice is not so much a matter of doing, but a way of being, or aligning with the subjective awareness of life. It is therefore like a posture as represented, for example, by the classic mudra, sacred hand position. Attention is aligned with the field, context, rather than the customary focus on content and details. Intuition is valuable and investigative rather than being dismissed as illogical. Also, spiritual work is more like noticing and becoming aware rather than doingness per se. Attitudes that may just seem merely nice to ordinary mind become very powerful tools when aligned with spiritual intention and commitment. For instance, to strictly live by the dictum of goodwill to all life is transformative when energized by the spiritual will. The decisions to be kind to all of life or to respect the sacredness of all that exists are powerful attitudes in spiritual evolution, along with the virtues of compassion, the willingness to forgive, and seeking to understand rather than to judge. By constant surrendering, perceptions dissolve into discernment of essence. Supplication and prayer to divinity are facilitated by a profound and deep surrender to humility. This humility is merely the truthful acknowledgement of the actual fact that the ego mind, by virtue of its structure and design, is intrinsically incapable of being able to differentiate truth from falsehood, essence from appearance. Emotion is not an indicator of truth, as it is both reflective and determinative of positionalities and conditioning. It is important to realize that both the level of consciousness and karmic propensities are consequences of prior acts of the will. In contrast, in ordinary worldly life, rewards are based on gain and demonstration of accomplishments or acquisitions. Surrender and humility are not the same thing as passivity because, paradoxically, both surrender and humility are positive acts of the spiritual will and are thereby in a positive agreement to allow rather than to get. Focus. In ordinary life, the mind focuses on linear content, specific details, and emotionalized perception. The ego is thus energized, consequent to projected, inflated estimates of worth or value. The process of energizing perceptions and desires is based on the ego's expectations of gratification and reward. In contrast, in spiritual endeavor, the focus is not on the result, but instead on alignment with an overall field of intention. The ego is oriented towards specifics and the linear content of the field of vision. Its effect on vision itself is exclusive and limited in order to focus primarily on the near side of objects, so as to facilitate manipulation. Spirit is oriented toward context and the whole, and is thus inclusive and focuses on the far side of objects. Its field is diffuse rather than local. To relate to the overall field, rather than become involved in the details of specifics, is characteristic of a contemplative lifestyle, which is conducive to spiritual evolution. In meditative practice, also, there is a shift from focus on specifics at the outset, but then progressive identification with the overall field and eventually with context itself. When vision is focused on a desired object, the focus is on the near side of the object. In contrast, looking at what or who is loved results in the inclusive shift of focus to the far side. In ordinary life, the ego mind goes from unfinished to finished, and then from incomplete to complete. In contrast, the spiritual pathway is a direction and style that goes from complete to complete as evolutionary states of emergence. Ego positions are interactive and usually represent a composite. For example, to disassemble anger may require the willingness to surrender the pride that underlies that anger, which, in turn, depends on surrendering a desire. This means surrendering the fear that energized the desire, which again is related to the undoing of imaginary loss, and so forth. Motivations are thus intertwined and mutually interactive, and operationally surrendering them leads to the next levels, which are comprised of dualities. The deeper layers, therefore, tend to surface one's belief about God, programmed spiritual expectations, and belief systems. Spiritual work is therefore a matter of exploration that transcends mentalized concepts, such as those of cause and effect. It is helpful to understand that a specific level of consciousness is aligned with an attractor field that, like a magnet, attracts similarities. Although the personal self likes to think that the thoughts going through the mind are my thoughts, they are actually only the thoughts that prevail at a given level of consciousness. It is like different depths in the sea attract different types of fish. Thus, if one's calibrated level of consciousness is primarily in the field of pride, then the field itself impersonally attracts similar supportive thoughts that are quite different from the ones that prevail with an overall attitude of neutrality or acceptance. Spiritual intention subserves, reinforces, and focuses on witnessing and observing rather than on doingness or specifics. Spiritual processing is like positioning oneself in the wind or in a water current. Spiritual motivation, intention, and alignment could be likened to changing the magnetic or gravitational field of influence by which context is shifted, revealing a different understanding. For example, a presumed loss becomes recontextualized as a hidden gain, greater freedom, opening of opportunities and choices.
Like I said, if I was, like when I did that stream, on the Kama Sutra and all that, I got over 900 views. But when I broadcast this here,
etc. By comparison, from the level of pride, the options are few and limited. But from willingness, surrender, and acceptance, the options are multitudinous. The will. The spiritual will is not like the
Forever Roche. some chocolate candy.
Was understanding of will as willpower, which means emotional force with clenched teeth of exertion and increased emotionality. The ego-driven will takes energy and is taxing. It could actually be understood as a form of aggression. In contrast, invoking the spiritual will is like opening floodgates and then standing back. The ego will contextualizes events in terms of cause and effect, in which the personal self-will claims credit or blame because it sees itself as a causal agent. In contrast, the spiritual will is not personal, but is a quality of consciousness that changes context by surrender to an invitation to the power of the self. The spiritual will calibrates at 850, and the personal will calibrates at only the person's current level of consciousness. The spiritual will, invited by complete surrender, is thus capable of performing the seeming miraculous, whereas the personal will, paradoxically, often automatically triggers resistances, as anyone knows who has tried personal willpower to overcome even minor habits. Surrender of the personal will to the will, wisdom, of God, or providence, higher power, signifies relinquishment of control. One can expect the ego to resist doing so, and it invents excuses, counter-arguments, and multiple fears in order to maintain illusory control. The ego's positions are reinforced by pride as well as desire for specific results. Thus, to the ego, to step back and invite the intervention of divinity seems like a loss, whereas to the spirit, it is definitely a win. Another limitation of the personal will is that it has no knowledge of karmic propensities or propitious timing, nor does it have the wisdom, omnipotence, to comprehend beneficial sequence. The self orchestrates with an inner knowingness of capacity. For instance, to try to face a certain conflict prematurely may be unsuccessful, whereas it would have been successful after a few other layers of the conflict had been resolved. Alignment of awareness. Spiritual alignment is with context rather than content. To watch the mind is far different from identifying with it. To witness and observe are beneficially removed from the alternative of emotional involvement and gain or loss participation in the world of perception. To watch the mind from a detached position is educational, non-stressful, and can be done with equanimity, whereas the consciousness level of the witness observer increases awareness. The ego watches with the expectation of doing or getting something. With the style of detached observation, the unfolding of life reveals itself to be the consequence of the spontaneous emergence of actuality as a manifestation of potentiality when conditions are favorable. By the practice of non-attachment, as compared to detachment, the spectator viewpoint can be maintained even during participation because the spectator learns about an event, but is not of it. Non-attachment becomes possible with relinquishment of the desires for gain. With deep surrender and continued alignment, identification with awareness eventually disappears, along with the loss of identification with the witness, observer, watcher. The self is innately complete unto itself, and is therefore not needful, nor is it subject to the positionalities of subject-object. The field is independent of content. Consciousness just is, with no stakes in the unfoldment of creation. Eventually, the autonomous spontaneity, whereby potentiality unfolds as creation, reveals that evolution and creation are one and the same thing. Question: Spiritual inquiry starts with acquired information derived from study, etc. This then results in the obstacle of the mind's conclusion that I know. How can valid information be held so as not to create the obstacle of presumption? Answer. To the seeker of the truth of the inner pathway of non-duality, all learning is held as tentative until the innate truth reveals itself and is validated experientially. This process is potentiated by recontextualization. Classically, the recommended position from which to hold information is clarified by the phrase, "so I have heard," which implies the holding back of transferring information into a belief system. That information has become an integrated knowingness is indicated by a transformational change of perception consequent to full understanding. This is often the result of reflection and contemplation. Question: can you amplify that with an example? Answer: both the Buddha and Jesus Christ taught that the basic sin, defect of humans is ignorance. Socrates taught that all men are intrinsically innocent because they always choose what they perceive to be the good, even though it is in error. A Course in Miracles teaches that everyone is intrinsically innocent and merely beguiled by the ego. Thus, sin means limitation, error, and misperception due to the impaired capacity. It also represents the limitation of evolution. Consciousness research indicates that the human ego mind is constitutionally unable to differentiate truth from falsehood by virtue of its construction. The mind is like the hardware of a computer that will play back anything for which it has been programmed, whether it be propaganda, misinformation, emotional distortion, bias, fallacious memes, slogans, etc. To fully know a reality is to be it, which is a transformative absorption and full integration. Complete acceptance would therefore result in the termination of judgmentalism, anger, resentment, blame, guilt, and hatred of self and others. Full acceptance, on the other hand, does not mean becoming an apologist for grossly negative, destructive behavior. A bull may misperceive a bystander as a potential enemy, but that does not mean that one thereby allows oneself to be needlessly gored. Spirituality is often confused with passivity. Moral obligation to respect and honor life includes one's own as well. Truth is strength as an expression of integrity. Moral stance is not the same as physical action, which in and of itself is neutral. The consciousness calibration level of an action is determined by intention. With progression of the evolution of consciousness, there arises the capacity for the Tao of the non-action of action, which is indicative of mastery and exemplified by the martial arts. Culpability is aligned with capability and actual possibility. It is akin to situational ethics, which includes overall context as well as content. Question: many spiritual and moral dilemmas, therefore, cannot be resolved within just the limited level of content. Answer: that is a clear observation. Even just adding historical and cultural context already alters the appearance of many phenomena. To understand the evolutionary origins of the ego itself and its alignment with the support of animal evolutionary life creates a more comprehensive, expanded paradigm from which to view human motivation and behavior. Available options are limited by the level of consciousness and vary quite differently from one level to another. This realization also facilitates compassion instead of judgmentalism. Much judgmentalism arises from posing the hypothetical. That is, that people should be different. However, if they could be, they would be. The hypothetically possible becomes actual by intention as well as the level of evolution of consciousness plus favorable conditions. One of the most important operational conditions that limits options and not available to ordinary perception is karmic patterns, including propensities and unresolved obligations, as well as the presentation of karmic opportunities. Question: what does karma mean? Is it not just a belief system? Answer: karma really means the totality of one's inheritance, which includes both the known and the unknown, both the linear and the nonlinear. To just be born a human being already represents the expression of untold millions of factors. Genes, or chromosomes, are merely the mechanisms of karmic transmission that already include the mechanics of physicality, the expression of which requires enormous informational patterns. Everyone already has a calibratable level of consciousness at the moment of birth that is thereby correlated with physicality itself. The Western world accepts karmic consequences subsequent to physical death as the destiny of the soul. The Eastern world accepts the reality of karma as an ongoingness of the evolution of the spirit over great periods of time. Consciousness calibration confirms and extensively demonstrates that every intention or action, even in its most minute details, is embedded and recorded forever within the infinite field of consciousness. It is also confirmable at consciousness level 1000 that everyone, without exception, is accountable to the universe, that is, the mind of God or divine providence, alluded to by whatever term chosen. Thus arises the wisdom that God is not mocked, and that every hair on one's head is numbered. Question: but are not many characteristics or events just accidental? Answer: the infinite eternal field of the unmanifest becomes manifest as creation by virtue of divine ordinance, as an expression of its essence. The power of the field is absolute and inclusive, all present and beyond time, and within it, manifestation occurs when conditions are favorable. Intention itself is also a contributing factor. There are no possibilities outside the infinite realm of reality because all possibilities have already been included within creation itself. The term accidental is a hypothetical absurdity, like proving that a physical object on planet Earth is not subject to the laws of gravity. Even the concept of chaos means unpredictable from a limited, linear, Newtonian, or mathematical viewpoint. Reason, logic, and predictability are limited to the consciousness levels of the 400s, whereas reality has no such limitations or restraints. All comes into actualization from potentiality, and the laws of karma are not only linear, but also contextualized via the nonlinear as well. Chaos is a mentalization that implies unidentifiable and unpredictable, which means not identifiable or predictable from a linear mathematical viewpoint, that is, no identifiable pattern. Context is local and Chapter 10, Spirituality and the World. Serious inner spiritual work may sound tedious and demanding to the ego, but is exciting to the spirit, which is eager to return home. Consciousness innately seeks its source. In so doing, it encounters obstacles from which it may periodically retreat, and this may result in periods of reflection and reorientation. Periods of resistance or even dismay are normal and to be expected. Their resolution is often the consequence of recontextualization. Although the personal will and motivation, plus the mind and intellect, are strong tools, in and of themselves, they do not have the strength to disassemble the ego because they are part and parcel of it. However, once a seeker becomes devoted, the strength of the spiritual will, via the presence of the self, supplies the necessary power. The inner work that arises as a consequence of commitment to enlightenment is, at times, admittedly, experientially difficult or even arduous. Although this is due to resistance, the sheer seeming difficulty may provoke discouragement or a temptation to abandon the goal. This, however, is also to be expected and therefore merely included in the material to be processed. Contemplation results in insights consequent to redefinition and recontextualization. In the meantime, other spiritual practices continue, such as meditation, prayer, service, and spiritual group activities. The letting go process encounters inner fixations and addictions to various ego payoffs and lures. Sometimes periods of retreat are helpful, and at other times, active involvement in spiritual activities is beneficial. Frequently, the seemingly impossible obstacle mysteriously and spontaneously disappears and resolves itself. Aside from ordinary resistances that are innate to the ego itself and therefore not really personal, there are inherited propensities as a consequence of karmic factors. These can sometimes be intuited, either by prayer or even by specific investigation, such as with past life recall techniques. Persistent patterns indicate that the source of the problem is still unconscious. A useful uncovering technique is to presume that there is a repressed aspect in the unconscious, and that the unconscious is not only personal, but also collective, described by Carl Jung as the collective unconscious. Thus, certain problems are merely the karmic inheritance of being human. In practice, for example, if other people persistently seem cruel or rude, it may be beneficial to forgive and pray for help for that hidden aspect in oneself that is cruel, rude, and unforgiving. These aspects can be accepted in that they are impersonal to some extent, yet one is responsible for them as a participant human being. For example, if others seem selfish or stingy, pray for that aspect in oneself that is that way. It is often surprising to discover that there is such a deeply repressed hidden trend that may well be just a consequence of human inheritance and experience. Asceticism. This is a useful practice at various periods by which one accomplishes detachment from the senses and their endless search for pleasure and sensation. Success brings a sense of accomplishment. The senses search for pleasure via amusement, excitement, and the lure of enticements that increase appetite and desire. Their origination was in the animal phase of evolution and instinctual in origin. A useful technique to overcome them is to delay gratification of sensory desires, and before seeking to satisfy them, surrender either resisting or desiring the sensations themselves. For example, the craving feeling, and not label them. Actually, one does not experience hunger, which is actually a nominalization, a label, and a diagnosis. The actual physical sensations are merely that, and not a need. When ignored and surrendered, they recede and fade away. Therefore, if there is a desire, ignore the desire and focus on the actual sensations themselves. In a surprisingly few minutes, the craving recedes. Another trick is to only eat when not hungry and to eat prophylactically in anticipation so as to avoid the resurgence of hunger later. This process is akin to deprogramming Pavlovian conditioning. Asceticism can be a discipline that is introduced into routine daily life on a modified basis and maintained as a lifestyle. It leads to economy of time, energy, money, and other resources. It is freeing to discover how little one actually requires in order to subsist, function, and enjoy life. Renunciation. This is a traditional type of spiritual retreat from the world, and sometimes done for variable periods, such as even just a weekend. True renunciation, however, in its full understanding, is the application of renunciation to the payoffs of the ego itself, and the identification of self with body, emotions, or mind. By renunciation and dissociation, through surrender and relinquishment, it is discovered that none of them are me or even mine. In actuality, they are autonomous functionalities. One can renounce the seeking of gain or worldliness as well as the seeking of pleasure, excitement, or titillation. One can renounce the assumption that perceptions are reality or essence. By renunciation, one can withdraw invested emotional energy and interest in the world without physically having to depart from it. Formal renunciation as a lifestyle has been and still is an option for devotees for whom such a major decision is appropriate. Such communities have prevailing requirements, and monastic orders are well known: Trappists, Dominicans, Benedictines, Buddhists, the Ramakrishna order, etc. Most require vows of allegiance and serious commitment. The world. The planet is part of the physical universe and thereby subject to its transitions and evolutionary phenomena. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, forest fires, and floods have been recurring over the eons of time, including the impact of giant meteors that filled the sky with dust and smothered all of life. It is therefore naive to assume that phenomena are consequent to mankind's follies, frailties, failures, or religious belief systems. So-called end times phenomena are redundant, both before and subsequent to the emergence of Homo sapiens. Numerous are the prophets and prophecies that have come and gone. When the great meteors hit and blanked out the sky, mankind was not yet even born. Contextualizing earthly phenomena as evidence of the wrath of God is primitive, naive, and an anthropomorphic distortion of the reality of divinity. God is not emotionally imbalanced or needful of psychological help, spiritual counseling, or anger management classes. Even if all these mystifications were true, of what interest is it, anyway, to the individual seeker? If life on Earth is to end in either a few years or in the year 6017 or 8095, so what? What does it really have to do with one's own level of spiritual evolution? The wise renounce public hysteria or mass suicides because a comet is sighted somewhere in space. Even if an end times catastrophe were to happen, it would seem to be a better decision to pray rather than kill oneself, inasmuch as one's death would be a certainty, and suicide carries karmic consequences. The evolution of human consciousness expresses its cultural and social changes that in turn reflect karmic propensities and inheritances of whole groups of people over great periods of time. In the East, karma is a matter of ordinary acceptance, but that is not so in the Western world, which even lauds unaccountability and irresponsibility as promoted by moralistic relativism. By consciousness calibration research, it is demonstrable that every thought, action, word, or deed is recorded forever, beyond time, in an infinite field of consciousness for eternity. It is affirmed by consciousness research that everyone is accountable to the universe, divinity, by virtue of divine justice. Thus, everyone already has a calibratable level of consciousness from the very moment of birth. Life is neither accidental nor arbitrary, nor is it based on anarchy. The stratification of levels of consciousness are influential by virtue of their prevailing, powerful attractor fields. Refer to power versus force, whereby like goes to like by attraction and alignment. Question: as a spiritual person, what is our responsibility in relation to world events? Answer: this depends on one's current prevailing level of consciousness. Confusion arises from mixing the levels. To act according to the spiritual principles of mercy, forgiveness, love, and compassion applies at all levels, of course. But how these are interpreted and what they are understood to signify regarding action depends on perception and degree of spiritual maturity. Earthly life affords maximum karmic opportunity to not only acquire good karma, but also to undo negative karma. For example, whole populations and groups have accumulated both positive and negative spiritual consequences as the result of barbaric savagery, just as they do in today's headlines. Thus, there are spiritual debts as well as benefits. While it is commonly believed that Christianity does not teach karma, that is not true. It does indeed, but it merely does not use the specific term. Christianity teaches that sin and virtue have very different consequences for the soul after death. These include the karmic alternatives of not only heaven or hell, but also purgatory. In addition, a traditional teaching is that man was born in sin due to the fall of Adam and Eve, and is thus karmically affected by succumbing to temptation and refusing obedience to God. Subsequently, God's mercy is represented by the presentation of a Savior born for the sake of man's redemption. As Jesus said, "None get to heaven but by me." In Buddhism, there is the Lotus Land, heaven, where an aspect of the Buddha speaks as an advocate. From another culture in a different time, Krishna also taught that those who worship and love God by whatever name are mine and dear to me. This is the same teaching presented in the 91st Psalm. The primary spiritual gift of human existence is the opportunity that by the option of one's own free will, divinity may be chosen or rejected by whatever name God is known. Thus, human life and the permission to incarnate as a human are great gifts in themselves, as was pointed out by the Buddha. Affairs of the world are perceived and interpreted in accordance with one's level of consciousness. Therefore, the world may appear to be tragic, sad, miserable, or fearful, or it may, on the contrary, seem tempting, exciting, and challenging. In the high 500s, it is viewed with compassion and seen as beauty. In the 600s, it is seen as peaceful, and then, in the 700s, as Ramana Maharshi said, the world you see, that is perception, does not even exist. Therefore, surrender it to God. Human life is a major spiritual opportunity for consciousness to evolve and even reach enlightenment. It is an expression of the gift of life, through which one can eventually realize the self. Worldly temporal life. Chapter 14, Enlightenment, the Presence of Self. Introduction. Positionalities result in the problematic dualities of the ego experienced as presumptions. These result in the ego's projections, which it erroneously believes to be reality. Collectively, they constitute the illusions of Descartes' res interna, cogitans, which means that they are the products of emotions and mentations. The purpose of spiritual work is the elimination of this primary barrier in order to discover res externa, extensa, essence, as reality revealed as creation, that is, the world as it is, essence, and not as it is perceived or appears to be. The transition from illusion, res cogitans, to reality requires not a change of content, but of context, and therefore of paradigm. The realization of reality is the consequence of a shift to identification with experiential context instead of content. And
I'm stopping it there on this today because I skipped around a little bit, but still all together got a lot to go. But I'm going to say, so for those of y'all who be in the clouds, ear hustling, and get y'all a little taste of what's coming up tomorrow. Prophet, I'll be back with something else, but I ain't going to play none of this. I'm going to play something. You know I got plenty of stuff to play. But I'll be back in a few minutes. Y'all need to subscribe.